while we're waiting for her, I'll just say hello and tell you a little bit about my role these days. So I was a reporter and editor for the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, for 24 years, and was the Washington bureau chief starting in 2003. And in 2007, proposed the idea for Politifact, which was pretty radical back then, and this is something that Angie and I are going to talk about a little bit today. Just 10 years ago, so it's just been 10 years, the idea of political fact-checking was still a little bit unusual. The political fact-checking movement had begun in the 1990s, prompted largely by a great column by David Broder in 1988. But it had kind of petered out, and so in 2003, it got a big boost from factcheck.org, which was started by Brooks Jackson and Kathleen Hall Jamieson. But that had, and they had done some good work, but I thought we could do something a little bit different by introducing structure to it. The idea that when we publish that you would have fact checks structured on some person and with a rating. And so we created the Truthometer. And so we summarized our journalism with a rating from true to pants on fire. And that was what was really different, and I think has been a way to bring new readers into fact-checking in both in the United States, and I'm proud to look around the world and see that there are now 129 fact-checkers around the world, many of them inspired by Politifact and what we've done. So, so about 4 years ago, I left Politifact to go to Duke and become the night chair at Duke, and handed things over to my good friend and amazing colleague Angie Holan. So we're going to sit and talk for a little bit.
Bill, it's great to be here with you. It's been 10 years that we've been talking about fact-checking, thinking about fact-checking. When I started at Politifact as a reporter, Politifact was an idea that Bill had in the newsroom of the Tampa Bay Times, and he did a little tour of the bureau with a cardboard sign on which he had drawn how he wanted the website to look. And he would go to all the different journalists in the newsroom and say, here's the idea for my project, what do you think? And even then, I think we thought it was a good idea, and it's been wonderful to see how it's taken shape and grown over the past 10 years. So I wanted to start off, Bill, what is your take right now at this moment in 2017 on the landscape of fact-checking? Where are we doing well? Where do we need to go next?
Sure. So, you know, I mentioned the number 129 fact-checkers around the world, and I think, you know, getting to Raphael's introduction of the first session, journalism has never been more important, and I think we can also accurately say fact-checking has never been more important. And so what was interesting, 10 years ago when we started, we had to spell Politifact. People didn't know what political fact-checking was. We would call campaigns. They were very wary about what we were doing. They didn't understand the Truthometer, and it took a while for readers to understand what this journalism was. And it is a unique kind of journalism. It's not news. It's not opinion. It is what I like to call reported conclusion journalism. So the journalists are objective. They need to be objective. They go out, they look at all the interpretations of the factual claim, and then render a conclusion. You know, what's amazing in those 10 years, fact-checking has grown, and it's now in so many places, in countries you never would expect, like Iran. Iran has a fact-checker. Iran has a fact-checker that uses a rating scale like Politifact. Now, those journalists have to work from outside the country to do their work, but it's really powerful, and you know, I think a great sign of the value of this journalism that they are going strong. It's called Factname. So where are we today? Lots more fact-checking. We're also beginning to, I I think, really tap automation to help fact checkers, both to help them do their journalism and to also spread fact checking to new audiences. At Duke, we just got a $1.2 million grant from Knight and Facebook and Craig Newmark for a very ambitious automation project where we're going to try to get fact checking onto your phone, onto your TV for live events. So you'll be able to watch live events and get fact checks that pop up in real time. So I'm very excited about that. I think that's a great trend. One that I'm concerned about, we could talk about in more detail, is fact checking, like all journalism, is caught up in this partisan divide in our country, and it really worries me. It's troubling because if we want to have a political discourse, we need to agree on facts to be able to have that. But this partisan divide affects fact checking just like it affects other kinds of political journalism.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The last panel talked about problems of public trust in journalism. I know that's a topic for later today at the conference. It's certainly something that we're always grappling with at Politifact. One thing that I go back to when I think about these issues of public trust is our method, how we do our fact checks. And we do try to explain this to the public, say this is how we fact check, this is our process, this is how we pick our facts to check. Do you think that's enough?
I think it helps, and I think it's really important to be transparent, and you know, Angie can talk in more detail about this process that is used to come up with a truth-o-meter rating that we call the star chamber, a phrase Angie came up with, that is really a process that has great integrity, in which the reporter has to present his or her facts, and 3 editors. I mean, at a time of shrinking news staff, Politifact still has 3 editors involved in the ratings. And so I think transparency about that would helps, but it's clearly not enough. And I think it's also important. I've talked to a Republican pollster about this problem, and he reminds me that the lack of trust that people have in journalism organizations is really part of a larger trend of lack of trust in institutions, in government, in big business, and things like that. So it's against that backdrop that people have lost faith in the news media. I think, and I gave a speech at UNC a couple of weeks ago where I said that I think people in the news media have been too slow to respond to this, and that this is a crisis. It's a crisis of confidence about the product of news, and that news organizations, I think, have been lulled into complacency by these big profits, by higher ratings. And so we can think, you know, oh wow, you know, since Trump got elected, subscriptions are up and web traffic is up, and that's good. There's a lot of interest in journalism. But the real truth is that there is this huge problem underneath of this growing partisan divide of liberals that love journalism and conservatives that distrust most of it. And so I think we've got to do more. In the fact-checking world, I think transparency helps. Politifact has been out on the road. Why don't you tell them about the Tulsa and West Virginia trips?
Right. Politifact recently has been working on issues around public trust. And one of the things that we've been able to do with a grant from the Knight Foundation is go to cities that voted for Donald Trump and just talk to them about fact checking and hear what they had to say. So recently we visited Mobile, Alabama, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Charleston, West Virginia. And it's been very heartening, number one, to have face-to-face conversations with our audience, with readers, with maybe people who don't know us but are just interested in what we're doing. The tenor of the conversations is very different than what happens online and with Twitter. And I was kind of struck by the last conversation. I think the vitriol that comes forth on Twitter is you just don't see that in real life. I think people have enough social inhibitions when you're face to face. That the conversations are much more level-headed. They're more productive. So what we've been hearing is that people uh, uh, want good information. They want good facts. I'm not sure that they're ever going to love the media, but I think that they uh, often they want good information and they're willing to invest in sources that they trust. One of the things that we've particularly taken is looking at our fact checks and being a little bit more literal, like just looking at the literal meaning of the words. I think context sometimes gets tricky and a little bit subjective. So one of the things that we've been doing is focusing a little bit more on, is this literally true? And that's something that we've been doing for a couple of years now.
You know, it's uh, and I think one thing PolitiFact has started to do a little bit is reveal how the ratings are done. Um, when we came up with the idea for the Truthometer, uh, really, it was, I mean, I remember I was like in a taxi in Secaucus, New Jersey, uh, typing the definition for what was then called barely true, is now called mostly false. And so the whole concept of PolitiFact, it's important to realize, was an improvisation, including the ratings. That, you know, we had this idea of a truthometer, but we didn't have a fully thought out, elaborate process, and that evolved. And I think it would help a lot for people to see that process and see the challenge of literal truth versus context. And this is something we've wrestled with from the beginning. You know, Mitt Romney does a commercial and it says, Barack Obama promised to help the auto industry, and now Jeeps are made in China. Well, that's actually literally true, you know, but the clear implication was that Jeep has moved its production overseas. And what had happened, in fact, was there was so much demand for Jeeps that they were also being made in China. So it's a very artfully worded campaign ad. And you know, that was like, well, how do we rate that? You know, well, we ended up rating that pants on fire because it was just so misleading to suggest that all production had moved overseas. But you could say, well, it's literally true, you know. So these are hard calls. This is not easy to do. And sometimes when I spoke at UNC the other day, a gentleman said, you know, he had some very thoughtful critiques of things, but ultimately his critique came down to get rid of the truthometer. That, you know, you really hurt yourself by having the truthometer. And I don't, you know, I think that's the heart of PolitiFact. And it's also really valuable because it is the summary of the journalism. It's not like it's just randomly pulled out of the thin air. It is the summary of extensive journalism. It's imperfect. It's not, you know, it's very difficult to pick that rating. But I think it's valuable. It also gets people talking, you know? So you could write a long blog post about about a campaign ad or whatever, and I would say, you know, some people would read it. Put a truthometer on it, and you're gonna get people to know what you've written. You're gonna get many of them more to read that article, and you're gonna get people talking, and that's a good thing.
Let's talk a little bit about training people in fact checking and teaching fact checking. To me, it seems like fact checking is so much a part of other news organizations that I just think it's a toolbox. It's a tool that every journalist who's upcoming needs to have in their toolbox, whether they work for a fact checking organization or not. At PolitiFact, we have a training program, but most often we're going into news organizations where the reporters already know the basics of reporting and writing, and we're teaching them an orientation, almost like a mental outlook of here's how you think about fact checking. You look at the literal words very carefully, you drill down to primary sources, you look beyond just the surface so that you can get really deep into the weeds, frankly. But what has been your experience at Duke of teaching students fact checking? Do you find that they get it right off the bat? Do you feel like they struggle with the idea?
I think some do and some come to it very naturally. Others, we've taught it in our intro news writing and reporting classes. Um, our colleague Mark Stencil also teaches it in an accountability journalism course. And I think students, I think it's important to teach. I guess I'll start with that. But it also requires a little higher level of skills. So I'm not sure. So I've been teaching it in the intro course. I'm not sure that's the place for it, but some students really get it. I do need to clarify one thing though, and the term fact checking can mean two different things. Fact checkers are the people at the New Yorker who take the finished articles and work with the writer to make sure that every sentence is correct. Fact checkers are also Angie and I, journalists who research political claims and render a rating or a summary of the relative accuracy of that. The fact checking that we are talking about is that political fact checking, researching political statements. Sometimes these things get conflated, and people will often say, I thought all journalists were supposed to fact check. Well, they do verify the content of their articles. What we're also seeing increasingly, and I was reminded of this yesterday watching CNN, is that we're getting more fact checking within news stories, and that's a wonderful thing. So yesterday, Joe Johns, White House correspondent for CNN, was doing a story on Trump and the controversy over his calls to the family of the victims of the soldiers who died in Niger. And Joe said something like, the president falsely claimed that Obama had not, and previous presidents had not done this. So falsely claimed is a phrase that we never used to hear. And I would say 10 years ago when we were starting Politifact, the idea of that sort of in the news fact checking was pretty rare. And now you have the New York Times in headlines saying Trump lied about something, in news articles stating up front that the president is making a false claim. I think that's a great thing. And that's why we should train all journalists how to do political fact checking, because it is not just a unique genre of political journalism. It should be part of news coverage.
Mm-hmm. I do want to open it up to questions, so I'll ask you one last question, and then we'll take questions from members of the audience, and there are microphones in the middle for anyone who would like to ask a question. But my final question for you is, here we are in the Trump administration, a very unique political personality holds the presidency. What is your take on fact-checking in the age of Trump? And do you think we have enough fact-checking right now, or does there need to be even more?
Well, the paradox is Trump has gotten more false ratings from the nation's fact checkers than any other politician that we've ever examined. And I say that not just us, but the Washington Post and factcheck.org and the Associated Press and the New York Times, I think, have all just found that he has, so often repeats things that are not accurate. In that sense, he has definitely boosted the profile of fact checkers. We're sitting up here today, I think in part because of this moment we're in our history where a president will just repeatedly make false statements. I think we can't let this get personal. We have to make this about the facts as we know them and assess the claims objectively. One thing I think is critical is that fact-checking needs to be objective journalism. I don't think having opinion organizations do fact-checking is the answer. You know, there's been some talk, you know, we need to get more fact checking from the right and left. It's like, I don't think so. I don't think that we need more on the left, on the right kind of commentary. We've got plenty of that. Just turn on CNN, turn on any of the networks. I think what we need is more objective journalists doing this important work.
All right. Are there any questions from the audience? Anyone? Feel free to come to the microphones in the center.
Yes. Good morning. I'm Deborah Potter. I'll be teaching in the spring at the University of Montana. And I'm curious about whether you have been following a lot of the research that's been done on fact-checking and what difference it makes. The concern is that you can fact-check all you like, but a lot of people seem to be reading those and doubling down on the original belief. And there's some contradictory results in these kinds of research projects as well. So I'm just curious about what your view is of effectiveness of fact-checking.
You bet. I do follow that research, and I've noted that the more recent studies have, in fact, contradicted some of the earlier studies. The earlier studies said that people do double down. There was a phrase that came up called the backfire effect, the idea that the fact check actually has the opposite impact and that people double down. But two studies in the fall contradicted that. I follow this. I'm interested, particularly what it means in the what it means about how fact checks should be presented. Are there ways that can be? Are there alternative ways that we can present fact checking so that it is more likely to get read? And this kind of gets to our fundamental role. Is our role to persuade people, or is our role just to give them information? And from the beginning, people would sometimes say, well, fact checking doesn't work because politicians keep lying. And I always laughed at that because I thought that would be like saying investigative reporting doesn't work because politicians are still crooked. Like, hey, our goal is to give people information. So I think we do that well. But we can do it better and present it in alternative ways. And I'm intrigued by something that WFAA, the Dallas TV station, has done called Verify, where they kind of take a viewer along as they assess things. Some of those have been fact checks. Most of them have been more consumer-oriented things like, does SPF 50 sunscreen really help you more than SPF 30? So, but I would love to see them do more political fact checks and to explore that as a way to present information in a different way. I also think this kind of in-your-face, pants on fire, so-and-so said this, got a pants on fire. I'm also interested to test different ways of presenting fact-checking that might not have the rating up front immediately. And we're going to do that in this, in our automated fact-checking project, which is called Tech and Check. We are going to explore different ways of presenting the content that might not be so confrontational.
Yeah, I agree with most of what Bill said. We do monitor the research, but some of it is contradictory. And then what I would add is that for me, journalism has always been driven by values of truth. And I would want to continue fact-checking even if the studies showed it didn't work at all, because I think there's a simple value in just saying this is accurate. The people who hold power not speaking honestly. Here's the correct information. For me, just that's the role of journalists. And when we become journalists, we embrace that. Whether studies show that it works, and I would put works in quotes, or not. So we'll keep on fact checking regardless of what the studies end up showing.
We got 2 minutes. Probably time for one more.
One more question.
Hi, my name's Liz Burge. I teach at William Patterson University, which is part of the state system. My question is, what's the difference between a false claim and a lie? And if they're the same, why don't we just call them a lie?
So the New York Times has wrestled with that and decided that in some cases it's going to use the word lie. I think the definition is a lie is a willful falsehood, where the person knows that it's false. At least that's how I've always interpreted it. And I have stayed away from the word lie, except once a year. Because we can't know. Does Trump know that that's false? I think he probably does. If you read Art of the Deal, there's some indications in there that falsehoods are sort of part of his strategy. We, though, plead, plead guilty, but we do have at Politifact the Lie of the Year, which was something that we started in 2009, 2010, and where we pick the biggest falsehood, and that's the only time that we use the word lie.
It's a fascinating question because we get it from readers a lot, and I think many people who pause at the word lie see intention behind it. But I'm not even so sure about that. I think the word lie is a tricky word because we've all heard of people who are lying to themselves about, oh, this cookie won't hurt me or whatever. So I'm not sure that lying always has this intention behind it. For me at PolitiFact, I think lie is such a hot button word that it's not worth getting into the controversy over it, except once a year for the lie of the year. If we label something false or pants on fire, or we say it's inaccurate or misleading or lacks context or is exaggerated, I think people know what we're talking about, and at the end of the day, that's what matters the most to us.
And of course, the rating is pants on fire.
Pants on fire.
Falsehood teller, pants on fire. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Bill. This has been a real treat.
Thank you.